Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is the health and environmental justice impacts from peaker power plants in Boston, Philadelphia, and Detroit. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group, and we're very excited to have panelists with us today from Stratagen. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of the attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You can join the audio via telephone or via your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to expand your webinar console, you can do that by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled there. That arrow also can minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen. One thing that you might like to do with your webinar console when you expand it is to submit your questions and your comments in the questions box that you see circled here. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Do type your questions in. We'll try to get to as many as we can. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording within about 48 hours, most likely this afternoon or tomorrow. And we'll also be posting all of those materials on CEG's website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. That's a good URL to know because it's also where we post all of our upcoming webinars and all previous webinar materials. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to my colleague, Seth Mullendore. Seth is the President and Executive Director of Clean Energy Group, and he will be moderating our webinar today. Seth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you to everyone joining us today, and a big thank you to all of our presenters today. So as Sam mentioned, this webinar is being brought to you by Clean Energy Group. Clean Energy Group works across the country at the forefront of clean energy innovation to accelerate an equitable and inclusive transition to a resilient, sustainable, clean energy future. We work a lot with communities across the country to advance energy justice across multiple levels. The report that we're going to be talking about today, and our presenters are going to be telling you more about, called the Peaker Problem, is brought to you by one of our big initiatives called the Phase Out Peakers Initiative that we've been running for several years now. That's a collaborative effort working with on-the-ground groups, environmental justice groups, and community-based organizations that are opposing existing and proposed new peaker power plants that are impacting the health and well-being of their communities, and advocating for clean energy alternatives, renewables, battery storage, sometimes transmission efficiency and demand response alternatives to provide a cleaner peak power. So you can learn a lot more about the Phase Out Peakers Initiative and our other initiatives on our website at cleanegroup.org. With that, I'm going to introduce our panelists today. We have 4 folks that will be presenting. First up is going to be Shelley Robbins. She's a project director with Clean Energy Group, and most of Shelley's work is focused on the Phase Out Peakers Initiative. She was the primary author for the report, the Peaker Problem. So we're going to start with Shelley, then we're going to have a couple of longtime collaborators of Clean Energy Group from Stratagen. First up will be Aaron Childs, and Aaron is a director at Stratagen, which is a mission-driven consulting company focused on enabling a clean and just energy transition. Aaron focuses on enabling scaled development and deployment of clean energy technologies, including distributed energy resources, energy storage, and green hydrogen. Her work includes the development of policy analysis and business strategies that enable a transition away from fossil fuels and towards sustainable clean energy solutions. Then we'll have Eliasid Animas, who is a consultant with Strategy, working on Stratagen's decarbonization strategy practice area, where he helps utilities, technology companies, governments, and non-government organizations to trace and achieve their clean energy and decarbonization goals. His expertise includes analysis and planning of energy resources, cost, benefit, and storage dispatch analyses, evaluation of long-duration storage, distributed energy and peak energy technologies, and working on Western markets and structured energy markets. And then we're going to finish with Marielle Mango. Maria is also a project director with Clean Energy Group. Her focus is mainly with our Resilient Power project that's to enable the access and benefits of solar and energy storage for communities. Amari really led a lot of the community-based partnerships and collaboration on this report, and she's going to be talking about that aspect of the work. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Shelley, and we'll be taking your questions throughout. So please, as you think of them, put them in the question box, and we'll get to those at the end.
Great. Thank you, Seth. I hope everybody can hear me properly. Make sure I can get control of things. Super. All right. I guess a big question is why? Why are we doing this report? So I'm going to go over why this report, some of the health findings, and then some of the city highlights from Boston, Philadelphia, and Detroit. This report arose from success actually in New York City. The details of that success are outlined in Appendix A. This is a big report. There are a lot of different parts to it, but Appendix A tells the story of our work with the PEAK Coalition. But in short, CEG was part of a coalition that formed in 2020 called the PEAK Coalition, and the goal of that coalition was to end peaker plant pollution in vulnerable communities in New York City. And it was the first comprehensive effort in the US to reduce the negative and racially disproportionate health impacts of the peaker fleet and replace them with non-combustion alternatives. The PEAK Coalition is comprised of New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, UPROSE, the Point CDC, and Clean Energy Group. And so if it weren't for that work, we probably wouldn't be here doing this today. So why, let's see, advance that. It's not advancing. Okay. There we go. All right, so why this report? Well, peaker power plants, just to back up just a little bit, they're a special kind of plant that only fire up when the load on the grid is higher than what baseload plants can manage. Baseload plants are the ones that run almost constantly 24/7, and they generally have pollution controls and tend to be more efficient than peaker plants. By contrast, peakers ramp up and down, turn on and off really quickly, and they have a narrow peak. And older plants often do not have any form of emission controls, and they can't be retrofit. So they're dirty. Because they tend to be located in urban areas because they're closer to load, and we'll see a map later on that shows that. And then another reason why this report was because of that work with the PEAK Coalition, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the reports that were produced by the PEAK Coalition. But that work proved that data-driven, community-led efforts can be successful. So looking at, let's see if I can advance the slide. All right. So to the first point that peakers have a disproportionate impact on low-income communities and communities of color, these next two tables make that abundantly clear. On the left is the low-income percentile. So the deeper the purple, the more low-income citizens live within a 3-mile radius of a peaker plant, and this is at the national level. And on the far right is the average NOx emission rate of peakers impacting that percentile. This data is from the peaker plant mapping tool on CEG's website, and I put that web address here on the slide, and I recommend looking at that mapping tool at the website shown here. The tables show data distribution, and the maps show the geographic distribution element. But if you look at those last two lines, those NOx emissions for those last two groups of percentiles, you can see they are much higher than for the first percentile, which is your higher income population. All right, and this one looks very similar, but different data. This one is for people of color percentiles. So on the left, persons of color percentile on the left, and then NOx emissions on the right. And I'd really like to call your attention to the stark difference between the first and the last NOx rate boxes. So basically the wider the community, the lower the average NOx emission rate, and then the more persons of color, it jumps pretty dramatically for that last group of folks. So the data is very clear on this. Okay, so I'm still not advancing. All right. Now, to that third point about why we initiated this report, a little bit more information about the Peak Coalition. First, the peaker plants, it was found the peaker plants in New York City were contributing 94% of the state's NOx emissions on high ozone days, while providing as little as 36% of the gross energy load. So in May of 2020, the Peak Coalition released a report called Dirty Energy, Big Money, detailing the real social and economic costs of the New York City peaker fleet. And that was followed in 2021 with the Fossil Fuel Endgame, which details a strategic and policy roadmap to retire and replace all of New York City's fossil peaker fleet by 2030 using a community-led process and strategy. These reports are just one aspect of the Peak Coalition's work, and those community-led and research-based efforts, combined with New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, called the CLCPA for short, with those provisions resulted in some extremely impactful announcements and rulings starting last fall that have the potential to remove right now 9 of the city's 18 peakers, which amounts to more than a third of the city's fossil peaker emissions between now and 2030. So this report is building upon the previous work as part of Peak in New York City. All right, now, before we talk about the health impacts of peaker combustion emissions, let's first take a very close look at small particulate matter called PM2.5. PM2.5 is emitted both directly from combustion processes, and it is formed in a secondary way when other combustion emissions, such as NOx and SO2, clump together. So let's consider the size of PM2.5 up there in the top left. The size of a human hair. So PM2.5 is obviously 2.5 micrometers in diameter. A human hair is 50 to 70. The alveoli in our lungs are 200. So therein lies the problem. That is why combustion emissions are so harmful to the human body, because it's so easy for them to get into those tiny air sacs and travel. Now, on the left, we have an illustration that shows how NOx and PM2.5 negatively impact so many different systems in the body. And this graphic is, of course, in the report. You can take a much closer look at it there. But to cut to the chase, peaker emissions damage the human body, and they cut lives short. The American Lung Association looked at the value of those lives lost as premature death and the economic impact of avoiding these health impacts and deaths in their new report called Zeroing In on Healthy Air. And some of those statistics are included in our report, and they're here on the right. That report focused on the health impacts of eliminating the combustion emissions from both transportation and power generation. And it provided a great complement to this report. And I'll note here that our report has a list of resources in the back that includes the American Lung Association report, as well as similar research confirming these findings by the University of Wisconsin at Madison, if you want to dig deeper into that. Now here is that national map that I've been talking about. You can see very clearly that peaker plants, and these are all peaker plants, and this map was prepared by Stratogen, that peaker plants do cluster in the urban areas. And we're going to take a look, though, particularly at Boston, Philadelphia, and Detroit. We chose these cities because number one, because of the concentration of peakers in those cities in relationship to low-income communities and communities of color. But we also looked at them. We're not going to go into great detail in this report, but we also looked at them because they are each in a different ISO, or a transmission organization. So we're not going to talk too much about that today. So first, we'll look at Boston. So the map on the left, of course, we looked, Stratogen analyzed all of, they looked at the entire peaker fleet for the whole Boston metro area. So that's what you see on the left. But then we drilled down to look at the ones that really, we call them high impact peakers. Those are the ones, as I said before, that they are all closer to environmental justice communities, low-income communities, and communities of color that have historically borne the brunt of these emissions over time. And all of the ones on the left, in case you're wondering what all those little circles are without names, those are all in Appendix C in the back of the report, and that's the case for each city. We kind of look specifically at these particular ones. Some of them are much closer into the Boston area. Some of them are out just a little bit, but they all are close to communities that are traditionally more heavily impacted by fossil fuels and other harmful infrastructure. And I'm going to call up, with each city, I'm going to call up a particular plant and take a look at it. In this case, in Boston, this is the M Street Jets. This peaker is quite literally to Pratt & Whitney jet engines. And those are those green stacks right there, and you can see they're very close to ball fields and a neighborhood. They're right there. And those jet engines back up the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority system. They don't have a very, they don't run very often, but when they do, they're pretty dirty. Because they don't run very often, that's one of the factors that we look at that would make them a pretty good candidate for replacement with non-combustion alternatives. We outline all those non-combustion alternatives in the back, in Appendix B of the report. Just for folks who aren't familiar with those terms in general, we outline that in Appendix B. So that's just kind of one particular peaker in Boston that, when you look on the ground, it's like, wow. I can't believe it's sitting right there next to ball fields. All right, so next, we'll take a quick peek at Philadelphia. Philadelphia is impacted by its neighboring states, New Jersey and Delaware. When we zoomed in on the right, we looked just specifically at the Philadelphia peakers because that city is our focus. So we didn't zoom in on the ones in the other states. However, again, they are listed in Appendix C. So we've got several plants just in the Philadelphia area that have a pretty high impact. And I want to, all right, this one, Schuylkill, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's kind of a tough word, but that peaker plant, Philadelphia is known for its row houses, row house neighborhoods, and that is Schuylkill Combustion Turbine sitting right there in that neighborhood. That one is owned, it's a 52-year-old plant owned by Exelon Corporation, and it bookends the South Philadelphia neighborhood, also known as South Philly, along with the Southwark plant. Its NOx emissions are pretty darn high, 14.93 pounds per megawatt hour. The Southwark plant is also owned by Exelon, and I'm going to show you what I mean by bookending. All right, so here is kind of a Google Earth view of South Philadelphia, and you've got the Southwark plant down on the right, Schuylkill up on the left, and there are only 3.3 miles between those plants and that incredibly vibrant urban grid in the middle. So those folks who live there, they're bookended by peaker plants. And I would say that both plants are very, very old, and they both have high NOx emission rates and low capacity factors. So looking at these factors alone, they would make good candidates for replacement with non-combustion alternatives. And it would also be an excellent thing for those communities. All right, and now here is Detroit. Again, Detroit on the left, all the Detroit Metro peakers that we considered, they're back in Appendix C, and then the Detroit high impact peakers are there on the right. And this one, this is Dearborn Industrial. Every time I show this photograph, it elicits a few gasps. This is the Dearborn Industrial Generation gas turbine, nicknamed DIG. The neighboring community actually has successfully fought the addition of additional capacity to this site, thank goodness. But unfortunately, this facility is still here, planted right next to an elementary school and a playground. That is Salina Elementary on the right, and the playground, and there are the stacks. This one is owned by Hydra Co Enterprises, and it is a subsidiary of CMS Energy Corporation. So yeah, these are the kinds of things that that we were looking for when we were looking for those high impact peakers. A lot happened right after we published this report, and I imagine we'll get questions. I believe the Inflation Reduction Act is actually being signed into law today. And it actually has major positive ramifications for this work in the peaker space. First off, it has tax credits for battery storage for those entities that have a tax liability. It also has direct pay options for tax exempt entities such as states and political subdivisions. And there are quite a few peaker plants that are owned by, MBTA, for example, is a probably one of those entities that could take advantage of the direct pay option, since it probably doesn't have a tax liability. And it also allows for the transfer of tax credits to another taxpayer. And they make that a lot easier. So that's all well and good, but how are the, if entities do decide to start replacing their peaker plants with battery storage, using these generous tax credits and direct pay options, the question becomes, how do they do it in a way that most directly benefits environmental justice? And that's where this report can come into play. First, it identifies the peakers located closest to low-income communities and communities of color in Boston, Philadelphia, and Detroit, those particular cities. But beyond that, for communities elsewhere in the country, the report provides tools, data sources, and strategies for identifying peakers impacting those communities in those locations. So it's sort of a roadmap. If I were going to utilize the Inflation Reduction Act to target the closure of a peaker, how do I choose which peakers will have the greatest environmental justice benefit? And so just because there's a tax credit does not mean that EJ is baked into it. There has to be a little bit more work put into it than that. So with that, I will turn it over to Stratogen to talk a little bit more about some of the great technical stuff.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Childs, and I'm a director at Strategen Consulting. Our team at Strategen has been privileged to support Clean Energy Group in developing robust data and analytics to assess the community impacts of peakers, and also to support the collaboration with community groups to help build approaches to retire those fossil fuel power plants. Strategen is a mission-driven consulting company and focused on enabling a clean and just energy transition. And our team works on enabling the scaled deployment of clean energy technologies to help enable a transition away from fossil fuels. So I'm going to provide a little bit of background and context on our analytical approach before turning it over to my colleague Eliasid to speak to some of the specific findings that we developed for this report. So first, I want to orient everyone on what we mean when we oftentimes talk about cost effectiveness. Generally speaking, when you hear folks talk about cost effectiveness, they're really talking about financial or energy market cost effectiveness. And they're thinking about the installed costs of a resource and the energy market revenue streams that that resource can produce. But when we're talking about community impacts, what Shelley is, we really need to start including some of these non-market benefits, which include things like the health and mortality benefits that Shelley outlined, as well as things like climate change mitigation, resilience in the face of extreme weather, and job creation. So what you're seeing right now is a little bit of a snapshot of some of the non-market benefits that we help to identify through our work with the Peak Coalition in New York City. And so, I know our discussion today is focused on other regions, but hopefully this should give folks a sense of the scale and the magnitude of these impacts and the way that they can factor into cost effectiveness. Again, you were seeing some very large numbers from Shelley as we were talking about health and mortality impact. So it's really important to keep in mind these components as we're starting to have these conversations about transitioning away from peakers and what that looks like for impacted communities. So the next thing I just want to make sure that everyone understands is just a little bit of the context on replacement of peakers with clean energy solutions, namely energy storage. And I think it's really helpful to make sure folks understand that this is a very feasible, technically feasible transition. Energy storage has all of the performance characteristics that are required to replace the grid services currently provided by peakers. So specifically, energy storage has some really fast ramping capabilities. In fact, faster than peaking power plants. And so they have the ability to ramp up and down much more quickly, integrate renewables much more seamlessly, and so are considered to be a very integral part of the clean energy transition on that front. The other important characteristic about energy storage is that it has a relatively small physical footprint. So many times peakers will be sited, as Shelley showed, right next to other community resources like schools. And this is because they have a very small physical footprint. They can fit onto a very small parcel of land, unlike, for example, wind or solar resources. Storage, on the other hand, has that very small physical footprint, much like peaker power plants, and so they are really, really perfect for deployment in urban areas, and they can help to address local reliability constraints without producing any additional emissions. And the last thing that storage does really well that has helped it to step into this space historically filled by peakers is the ability to provide some really fast grid services, voltage response, local reliability services that just help to keep the grid running really smoothly and keep the lights on no matter what happens. So this is really important context for folks. Just remember, these transitions are super duper feasible and they're happening right now. Right, so we have seen the deployment of energy storage to replace both aging fossil assets as well as newly planned fossil fueled power plants. We're seeing this across California and New York right now, heavily driven by some of the clean energy policies, including CLCPA, which Shelley mentioned. But we're really excited to see this work with Clean Energy Group start to advance some of these lessons learned and best practices to support the work of communities across the country. And so with that, perfect intro to turn things over to my colleague Eliasid Animas to talk a little bit about some of the work that he developed. Oops.
Oh, thanks, Erin, and hi, everyone. I want to start saying that these kind of successful cases and our own decarbonization engagements have convinced me that there are some economic, environmental, and equity reasons to target peakers, and that their replacement is feasible and cost-effective from a planning perspective. I think that it was the same thinking that inspired the Clean Energy Group to get us involved in this project and take a step back from our localized work to get a national view of the peaker problem. So together with the Clean Energy Group, we used a top-down approach to leverage public data and quantify the impacts of peakers across the country. So this exercise allowed us to identify hotspots of peaker externalities, but also opportunities and priority areas for the replacement. As you can see from this slide, we identified a rather large peaker fleet based on power plant operations. This is almost, I think, 1/3 of the fossil fuel generation capacity in the States. So, while the peaker fleet by definition is not used very often, it tends to be located close to urban areas. So when it goes wrong, it disproportionately affects the health of millions, in many cases, people living in disadvantaged communities. After this initial screening, we looked at the replacement opportunities and considered a more localized set of factors. But Shelley already told you about those local use cases, so I'll walk you through the more general and more technical methodology of the study. So first, we started by defining peakers. We considered a peaker plant any gas or oil plant that, because of its technology, was able to provide power during peak times, and that was utilized less than 15% of the time during the last 3 years. This threshold, I want to add, is a result of our empirical work on the topic, and I think it encompasses the majority of the peakers in the country. But some might have been lost in this high-level analysis, but that's why we did a local level analysis afterwards. But then we jumped into the data, and for this work, it was very important for us to use only publicly available data that other folks can easily pull to create their own analysis and look at their own communities. So for this, we relied on EPA's tools and reports. For those joining from overseas, the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, and we looked at sites like the eGrid that records operational data from power plants, the Air Markets Program with detailed historical data on emissions, the power plants and neighboring communities mapping tool that combines many data sets and allows for geographical visualization of them, as well as demographic data from the US Census and the Environmental Justice Screen, also created by the EPA. Having this data mapped down, we were able to identify places of interest, where we then looked at market rules, local policy, energy prices, neighboring communities, and even more detailed generation data to assess the opportunities and urgency to replace some of these urban peaker fleets. I'll be really happy to answer, more detailed questions. You can add them in the chat. But with this high-level view of the methodology, I'll pass things over to Muriel.
Mari, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that slight technical difficulty. Mariel Mango, I'm a project director with Clean Energy Group, and I will be discussing the community input that we had throughout this report to learn more about what's going on the ground in terms of peaker opposition, but also what's going on the ground in terms of efforts to build resilience other ways through policy, program development, community action, things like that. I want to highlight that well, I'll be going through the folks that really help contribute to the report. This is really just a snapshot, and I really encourage everyone who's interested in their individual actions or the folks that actually are doing this work on the ground to reach out to them through our all the contact information in the groups can be found in the report. So I am going to start in Boston. We featured Green Roots Chelsea, Breathe Clean North Shore, Slingshot, and Massachusetts Climate Action Network. All 4 organizations are featured in the report and the work that they're doing. I like to pull out a quote by Susan Smoller, who is one of the founding members of Breathe Clean North Shore, who's working on peaker opposition efforts in Peabody, Massachusetts. And she said, "I've been going door to door and pointing to the smokestack next to where the current peakers are. Until this winter, when the site was clear cut, the generators were hidden from view. People seemed oblivious to what's there, what they're building, and how it will impact them." A lot of the folks that we talked to in Boston, Detroit, and Philadelphia that are working on the ground emphasize the same thing, that their neighbors and their community members understand the health impacts of the poor air quality because they feel them every day in their household, but they're not sure where they're coming from or how to fight them. And peaker opposition efforts have really worked to bring that up to speed. So a little bit about the organizations that we feature for Boston. Green Roots Chelsea is a nonprofit community-based organization working to improve the urban environment and public health in Chelsea, an environmental justice community in Massachusetts. In 2007, Green Roots was successful in stopping the development of a 250 megawatt diesel powered peaker power plant in their community. This was part of a larger coalition effort that spanned many years, a lot of active on the ground efforts, including petitions, protests, a spread of issues really, and they were successful in stopping that plant. They really focused their efforts again on the health impacts, and we've seen that across the organizations that we spoke with, that the folks really don't understand why their air quality is poor and how it's impacting their health, and they wanted to be able to know how they can have a direct action in improving that through pollution and emissions mitigation. So Chelsea has the 4th highest asthma rate in Massachusetts, and much of that can be due to the fact of the high pollution rates in the area. We also spoke to Breathe Clean North Shore. They are working on a current opposition effort for the Peabody Peaker plant, which is a gas and oil fired peaker power plant that is being developed right next to 2 existing peakers that are located, in an EJ community within Peabody, Massachusetts. Susan Smoller, who I quoted in the previous slide, is one of the members of Breathe Clean North Shore. In 2022, so this year, CEG and Strategen found that energy storage is not only a viable replacement option for the needed capacity for the Peabody plant, but is also preferable from an environmental perspective and results in significant benefits for consumers, including cost savings and environmental justice issues. So for this particular peaker plant, CEG and Strategen were able to support the efforts of on-the-ground folks to determine what would solar and storage look like in its place. And these efforts are ongoing with Breathe Clean North Shore and their partners, which include the Massachusetts Community Action Network, as well as Slingshot and their Fix the Grid campaign. Both of these organizations are supporting organizations like Breathe Clean North Shore on their on-the-ground efforts to oppose the peaker power plant. Oftentimes it's through statewide forums, articles, additional resources being built. Slingshot is actually helping Breathe Clean North Shore develop a campaign strategy that includes tactics, how they can reach out to more allies, how they can really get their position heard to folks outside of the community. And Slingshot also leads the Fix the Grid campaign, which has broader efforts to overhaul the regional energy grid throughout Massachusetts and really incorporate resilience, energy storage, clean energy, renewable energy in as an alternative to continued investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. In Philadelphia, we were able to speak with the Clean Air Council. The Clean Air Council works at the municipal, statewide, and federal level to protect residents from the harmful impacts of air pollution. And their advocacy director, Matt Walker, stated, "We must rapidly transition away from using fossil fuels for generating power and onto renewable energy supported by things like battery storage, energy efficiency, and smart programs that balance energy supply and demand." The Clean Air Council works again similar to MCAN and Slingshot's efforts in Massachusetts to really support community-based organizations on the ground. CAC provides advocacy support as well as law. They have lawyers on staff that are able to provide that support. And they're currently working to oppose Envergy's proposal to build a peaker power plant, 639 megawatt gas-fired power plant in Elizabeth Township in Southwest PA. And they are also supporting community efforts in Renovo, which is an environmental justice community in central PA. And there's a peaker plant being proposed there as well. That's over 1,000 megawatts. A lot of, again, the line between all of these groups is the connection of health, demanding health risk assessments, and demanding that there's cumulative reports, like in this case in Philadelphia, that really shows the risk of pollution from these facilities on air quality and public health over time. And these resources are really helping folks be able to understand how is their health being affected. Finally, in Detroit, we spoke to Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, Solidarity, and Highland Park Crisis Coalition through Solidarity. Bridget Vale, who's the energy democracy organizer with the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, stated, "We need state policies that slash toxic emissions by accelerating plant closures in EJ communities, prohibiting the construction of new gas-fired power plants, and supporting community-owned renewables." For the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, it's a statewide coalition that works to achieve a clean, healthy, and safe environment for environmental justice communities. And Solidarity is a nonprofit organization that serves the Highland Park community, an environmental justice community in the center of Detroit, in their efforts to transition to a just and equitable energy system for all. Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition works again a lot on the cumulative impacts of emissions on environmental justice communities with an emphasis on health. They're currently working on the campaign and helped to launch the campaign, Work For Me DTE, which is the utility. And they're really working with a lot of EJ groups locally that are mobilizing community efforts in opposition to DTE's 15-year integrated resource plan, which does not emphasize, in their opinion, enough resilience or renewable energy or EJ issues. And they're really trying to replace it with a vision of a healthy, affordable, and community-based energy system. Solidarity similarly builds community awareness about energy-related health concerns. They've worked a lot on extreme heat and the heat effect in EJ communities. They work usually as part of a broader coalition on issues related to clean energy, EJ issues in their community, and ways to reduce pollution and improve health. They're also a member of the Highland Park Crisis Coalition, who also works in Highland Park to uplift and empower Highland Park residents through social, economic, and ecological justice. Finally, we included here a lessons learned in regards to New Orleans. While we didn't feature New Orleans as its own separate city in the report, we did want to include it in terms of what the folks there on the ground were doing to implement change. We featured Together New Orleans, Feed the Second Line, and Alliance for Affordable Energy, who stated the 2021 and 2022 hurricane seasons put a spotlight on how vital resilient energy solutions are as the leading cause of death for both years of power loss, both directly due to extreme heat impacts and from carbon monoxide poisoning when families turn to fossil fuel generators. It is time to follow community leaders who know what they need to stay safe. I've highlighted here where the peaker power plants in New Orleans are located. For the purpose of this lessons learned, we're focusing on the New Orleans Power Station, which is a 126 megawatt gas plant in New Orleans. This was proposed in 2016, and there was major community-led opposition against the gas plant. CEG and Stratagen actually supported an analysis to show that solar and storage could provide the same services to the grid and would cost significantly less than the gas plant over time with the benefit of no emissions. This gas plant is located within 3 miles of 22,000 people. 90% of them are part of minority groups and 47% live in low-income households. So it's really in the center of multiple EJ communities. And what happened is that the Alliance for Affordable Energy, who's Louisiana's only dedicated watchdog organization working to protect consumer rights at the Louisiana Public Service Commission and New Orleans City Council, as well as other partners, including the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance, 350 New Orleans, Valia, and the local Sierra Club chapter, works to oppose this plant. And unfortunately, the city council approved the plant. They were really sold on Entergy's claim that the peaker would be able to jumpstart the grid in the event of a power outage, and really leaned on that as a way to improve reliability in the area and decrease the impacts of power outages on vulnerable populations. However, when the first major storm hit after the completion of the New Orleans power station, which was Hurricane Ida, the peaker plant failed to come online. There were weeks of power outages. The same health impacts that had been seen previously were seen once again, with carbon monoxide poisoning, extreme heat issues, inability to access refrigeration for medication or medical devices, outlets for medical devices. And, while they weren't successful in stopping the development of the New Orleans power station, I do want to highlight that all of these groups have moved on to improve resilience in New Orleans through the development of resilience hubs, through policy and program proposals that improve the economics for resilience, solar and storage systems for medically vulnerable individuals, for nonprofit organizations. Together New Orleans is leading the charge on developing community lighthouses, which are resilience hubs primarily in institutions of faith, so that all of New Orleans residents can walk within 15 minutes and be at a resilience hub in the event of a power outage. So there's been a lot of growth from this effort, even though the power plant was ultimately built. This is my contact information. I really do encourage everyone, if you have questions, feel free to reach out, but everyone should reach out to these organizations and learn more about their great work. We'll be working to have webinars later on this year featuring many of them. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marielle. Thank you to all our presenters today. We have a lot of questions, so we're going to jump into those now, and I'm going to jump around a bit in these questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And thanks for all the feedback from folks as well, including 2 different pronunciations for the power plant in Philadelphia. So that debate may rage on. We had some early questions come in just about peaker plants kind of in general, like what was the lifespan of a peaker plant, and also the proportion of old dirty peakers versus new peakers on the grid. So Aaron, LEC, I don't know if you guys have any sense of those questions.
Yeah, I can take a first stab at that. So a lot of these power plants, when they're initially commissioned and planned, will say something like, like a 30-year lifespan or a 40-year lifespan. But part of the challenge is that we see these plants hanging on for like 50, 60. I think the worst we saw was 70 years. And so by the time these plants get to be that old, they're very run down, they're extremely inefficient, they're antiquated technology, and so they oftentimes are running as peaker power plants because they're so inefficient that they can no longer run as a baseload resource or other resource. So, I think a big part of what we've been talking about with Seth and Shelley and folks is really, these plants are some of the worst offenders. They're extremely fuel inefficient. Their carbon emissions are very high because they're fuel inefficient, but also their local and particulate emissions tend to be very high for the same reason. And so these are, I think, what we think of as high priority plants to transition to cleaner solutions and to get retired.
Great, and there were some questions about those alternatives as well. This report doesn't go deep on what the alternatives are. It's more highlighting what the problem is and where some of the worst actors are and the health impacts of these power plants. But it doesn't get into as much about the alternatives. We've done a lot of work with Strategen over the years now, and we've done a lot of work on that. I will hand it over to you, Aaron, to talk more about that. But there are some reports that do look at this, particularly fossil fuel endgame in New York City. So Aaron, if you want to pick up from there about what these solutions look like and what the alternatives are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the slide I had that sort of said, hey, here's the 3 things that energy storage can do, and peakers used to do them and they don't need to anymore, should give you a sense, hopefully, that energy storage is a foundational part of the toolkit when we think about grid needs and reliability. But obviously, energy storage needs to charge from somewhere. And so an important part of conversation that we've been having is, what is it charging off of? Can we see options to deploy solar in local communities and create community benefit? Marielle was talking about resilience, right? And especially as we think about the ability to site resources in communities, you start to see ability to access multiple, benefits, including resilience, as well as charging storage, displacing peakers. There's a whole host of solutions, honestly. Even things like energy efficiency help to decrease demand on the system and make it less necessary to run those peaker power plants. So I don't want to spend, I could spend a full 10-15 minutes talking about this. I don't want to take up too much time, but hopefully that gives folks a sense of sort of what that toolkit looks like, part of the solution set, but of course happy to go into that further if there's additional questions.
And if I may,
go ahead,
I'll add, I was very intentional in using the word non-combustion alternatives in the report because I did not want to silo the possibility of what a community can do. And so we outline, we do have a kind of a brief description of all sorts of things from virtual power plants and demand response, all the different alternatives in Appendix B. But again, my choice of words there was very intentional.
Yeah, you guys touched on a couple of other things. Some people did point out that, yeah, there are behavioral changes that can reduce peak as well. This has to do when people are using energy or when consumers are using energy, whether that's people or businesses. So there's a lot of things that can be done even at the behavioral level to reduce and impact peakers. Shelley, you raised the non-combustion. There was a question about hydrogen, whether that could be a solution as well. This has been something that a number of utilities and oil and gas companies are very excited about. But when you're talking about combustion hydrogen, you do not reduce the NOx emissions. You don't reduce the health impacts on surrounding communities. In fact, hydrogen may have higher impacts on those communities. So yes, you get rid of carbon if you're using green hydrogen. There's a whole host of things we can talk about that as well, but you're not reducing the health impact, and you may actually be making it worse. So that should be factored into this. Fuel cells are different. That you do just get water, but when you combust hydrogen, you get all sorts of nasty stuff as well. And I did want to say we are recording this, and we will be sharing the slides because we got a lot of questions about this. So we'll be sending that all out probably within the next days so that you all have this. And a lot of the images that were presented here are available in the report as well, which is on our website.
And our hydrogen webpage is the very last resource. If anybody wants to go right to the last page, that goes right to our hydrogen resources page for the information.
One thing to a counter to the battery option is there was a question about sustainability of batteries as well. One, there was a question just, how long will batteries last in degradation and their actual lifespan versus peakers? And then two, the sustainability of batteries. There are sourcing issues and there's end of life issues as well. So just kind of throw that out there to anybody that wanted to elaborate on, the lifespan of batteries and their impacts versus, say, a peaker plant.
I would, one thing I like to have folks think about is, okay, when we first started burning coal, was anybody thinking about the end of life of coal? No, they were not. Same thing with gas. The beauty of where we are at this point in time is that, yes, as we are developing the supply chain, we are also at the very same time trying to figure out all of those problems and get ahead of that. So that is, there's a lot of work out there being done with battery recycling, moving EV batteries down to stationary batteries when they're no longer able to meet a certain kind of peak performance. There is so much being done on this issue right now. And so I have a lot of hope that folks out there are figuring things out. And Aaron, do you have?
Yeah, I guess just I can, at least answer one piece, which is, so when we see batteries deployed, they'll often be cited for 10 to 15 years, but developers will also look at extended contracts for 20 to 25 years. And that just means they'll come in and replace batteries if they're seeing any of the battery packs degrade or reduce in performance. And I think just echoing Shelley's point, we're seeing end of life and battery recycling being a really, really important area of focus for the energy storage industry. That industry is very aware that they are, riding a lot of, enthusiasm about kind of how we create a sustainable transition, and it's been very clear to us that the industry is interested to kind of rise to the challenge that folks are flagging here, and so we know that's an area of focus and kind of R&D work.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that with the battery recycling industry coming up and so much innovation happening there, that it's done equitably, right? That we don't create this entire next generation of recycled recycled batteries that are only used in LMI communities or only used at discounted prices in communities of color, and that it's an equitable industry where everyone sees the benefit of recycled batteries and not just kind of targeted towards specific communities.
There's a couple of questions I'll combine together here. One was a question about why are peakers even located in densely populated areas, which we didn't really cover here as much. Peakers tend to be located where the load is, where people, again, are using energy. This question also asked about transmission, and that is often the problem, that you don't have enough transmission to bring energy from outside of these densely populated areas into them during these peak periods. Usually it's fine, but during those times when it's strained, that's a problem. We're seeing in the New York City work that transmission is one of the solutions to get rid of peakers. That's actually been cited in some transmission projects. As we build these, we don't need these peakers anymore. And that leads to the other question I thought that came up is, do we even need these peaker plants that exist out there? I'd like to turn this over to Aaron and Eliaseed. Some people are asking, we've got some very low capacity factor things here. Are these things actually even needed, or are they just being kept around because somebody can squeeze a little bit of revenue out of them?
Yeah, I mean, the question of do we need them really, I think, is good. Peakers generally, I would say, provide a grid service, right, or a set of grid services, and that's why they've been kept online. The question of do we need to continue to rely on them now that we have solutions like demand response, energy storage? For peakers that are running fewer and fewer hours of the year, it becomes so much more feasible to look at these other solutions to replace the energy that comes from a peaker, right? Would you rather have a peaker fire up in your backyard, or would you rather, run your washing machine later in the day, or modify some behavior? So I think there's a lot of what we're seeing, and what we're seeing in the conversation is that there's a lot of solutions that can reduce our reliance on peakers and make it much more feasible to turn them off. And also, there are folks who have responsibilities to operate the grid and make sure everyone's lights turn on when you turn on the switch. And so making sure that those folks are comfortable that these solutions that we're putting out there allow them to continue to do their job while halting the pollution that we're seeing coming out of these peakers. So
circling back to demand response, in addition to like behavioral shift, that can also, from an energy burden standpoint, that can help lower bills if you're using, if things are designed correctly, if households are properly incentivized, that will lower their bill and therefore lower energy burden. So that's another benefit.
I also, some of the communities have brought up multiple times, the organizations that I spoke with, that if these peakers were sited in upper income communities or high income communities, that they would be much quicker to find replacements and other alternatives to ensure that they didn't have to be built, right? And that oftentimes there's transparency issues when peakers are being built, that the community doesn't know about it until much later on, and that they have a much higher disproportionate. I know the Peabody plant in Massachusetts, for instance, the Peabody community is paying a huge price tag for that power plant without really having been educated onto it at all. So a lot of peaker power plant development is intentional and where it's located, and who knows about it. And if it was not that way, and it was a transparent process, and these were located in communities, regardless of your socioeconomic status, I think we'd be seeing innovation a lot quicker.
Yeah, thank you. We don't have a lot of time left here. A question came in from somebody who had clearly read the report, so thank you for that, about the American Lung Association numbers for health impacts and mortality, how the fact that those combine multiple combustion sources, transmission, and power plants, which in the peaker opposition effort is not entirely useful, because they want to be able to untangle that. So Shelley, can you speak to maybe other tools that people could use to be able to isolate more what is the impact of these peaker plants?
Yeah, and we've got the tools in the back of the report, and the EPA has, I have to pull it up now, there's so many of them. All right, Seth, you might know it off the top of your head better, But
I can
EPA,
probably jump in. I think the Cobra tool
yeah,
is probably
Cobra
good.
and Avert.
Mhm.
Yeah, those are in the back of and links to links to those are in the back of the report. Cobra stands for the Co-Benefits Risk Assessment Health Impacts Screening and Mapping Tool. And then Avert is Avoided Emissions and Generation Tool. And those two can be used together to kind of zone in that they both have a web-enabled version, but then a much more functional and nimble downloaded version where you can see data and emissions data and basically the health impacts and the dollar impacts at a much more minute level. Aaron might be able to help me with this, I see.
Yeah, actually, Eliasid, would you mind maybe talking about some of the public data tools that we used for this and help folks understand sort of what kinds of information they can find there?
Yeah, I think that I touched on a couple of them. The one that I probably want to highlight again is the power plants and neighboring communities mapping tool by the EPA. I think, if you don't want to download data sets and use GIS to map them, I think that gives you a snapshot, at least, of some of the most important facts to know about each power plant that is located close to communities. It basically combines power plant data, emissions data, and data from the environmental justice stream, which already considers demographic, environmental, and social facts to create indexes of vulnerability. So combining that, you can, if you are looking at this from your own community, you can like zoom in, look at the power plants around your community, and look at their impacts. So I think that's the one that I like.
All right, a couple of plugs that we've taken all the peaker data from that EPA mapping tool and put it in a peaker mapping tool that if you go to our Phase Out Peakers initiative webpage on cleanegroup.org, then you can see that all broken down, and there are maps showing the impact of peakers on low-income communities and communities of color there. Also, a plug for, we did a webinar with EPA on Avert and Cobra earlier this year, so you can find that in our webinars. So I think we're about out of time here, so I'm going to close things off now. I thank all of our presenters. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. And please reach out to us with any other questions you have. And I want to turn it over to Samantha to tell you about a couple of additional webinars that we have coming up.
Thanks, Seth, and thank you so much to all of our speakers and to everyone who attended today. So on your screen, you should see some information about a handful of upcoming webinars that we have. I won't read all of these out loud, but you can see the titles on your screen and you can read more about them on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. It's a good lineup. I hope you can attend some of these. And if so, we'll see you then. Thank you all again. Bye-bye.
Hi, my name is Patrick Collins, and I'm an Integrated Resources Analyst at Selco. Today I'm going to talk to you about renewable energy and electric vehicles. Did you know that electricity can be made from the natural forces and energy that surround us? We call this renewable energy, and it's made from resources that nature replaces, like wind, water, and sunshine. Renewable energy does not create pollution like energy from coal and oil. A lot of energy is wasted to make power from fossil fuels, like natural gas, coal, and oil. No energy is wasted when using solar power. Solar panels are super efficient because there's no need for combustion or burning stuff to make the electricity. The sun has produced energy for billions of years. This means that people have used solar energy since prehistoric times to cook food, keep warm, and dry clothes. Have you ever sat outside on a sunny day and felt hot or even got a sunburn? Solar panels turned this very energy from the sun into electricity. In 2019, Selco built a large solar project on top of Shrewsbury's landfill that can produce enough electricity to power 300 homes every year. Solar panels are also called photovoltaic panels, or PV panels. photo is Latin for light, and voltaic means electricity. If you have solar-powered lights at your house or solar-powered calculators, you're using photovoltaics. Solar panels are not just for houses. They are used to power many different things. Maybe you've seen them on food trucks, cars, boats, buildings. There's even one on the International Space Station. Have you ever seen a windmill? It looks like a big outdoor fan. People have harnessed the power of wind since the Middle Ages, during times of knights, lords, and castles, to do things like grind grains and pump water. Windmills have been used to generate electricity for more than 100 years. These are called wind turbines. Turbines generate electricity by working the opposite way of a fan. Instead of using electricity to turn the blades to make wind, it uses the wind to turn the blades to make electricity. In order to create a lot of energy for thousands of homes, large wind farms with lots of wind turbines can be built. They usually build these in consistently windy places, like hilltops or even the ocean. These are called offshore wind farms. Our state has plans to build wind farms in the ocean. Selco is a member of Berkshire Wind Power Cooperative. Berkshire Wind is a 12-turbine wind farm that sits on top of Brody Mountain in western Massachusetts. This wind farm is big enough to power about 7,800 homes every year. Hydropower is also another renewable energy source. Hydro comes from the Greek word for water. Falling or flowing water from a big river has lots of energy. Hydropower plants capture this energy using a turbine just like a wind turbine. There are 3 main types of hydroelectric power plants. One type is called run-of-river, where the natural flow of water turns turbine generators. Just like windmills, these hydro systems have been used for thousands of years on farms to grind wheat into flour that we bake into bread, and at mills that make clothing and timber. Maybe you've seen an old water wheel like this one, connected to a building located on a river. There are plenty here in New England. Another type of hydroelectric power plant is known as storage system, that uses a concrete dam. These dams can be really, really big, like the Hoover Dam. The dam stops and controls the flow of a river and stores water in a lake or reservoir. Some of the water is released into the bottom of the dam. The fall of the water and the water pressure from the lake forces the water through the dam and spins a turbine generator. The last type of hydropower is known as a pumped storage system, where water is pumped up to a reservoir at a higher elevation. When electricity is needed, the water is released to spin turbines that generate power. Usually the water is pumped up during the night and released down during the day when there is high electricity use. The main drawback to renewable energy is that it is not always readily available. For example, the sun doesn't shine at night. Some days aren't windy, and sometimes water isn't flowing fast enough. That's where things like big batteries come in handy. Batteries the size of trucks can be connected to a big wind farm or solar farm like Selco has at the landfill, and can charge up during the day when extra power is being produced, then discharge that power during the night or at other times whenever it's needed. Did you know exciting things are happening with electricity? The same electric energy that powers appliances, light bulbs, and electronics in your home is also powering cars, trucks, motorcycles, bicycles, and more. Throughout history, cars and trucks have traditionally been powered by gasoline, a fossil fuel. But things are changing. Now vehicles can be powered by gas, electricity, or even both. People are plugging in cars just like they do with phones and iPads. There are 2 main types of electric vehicles. Battery electric vehicles, known as BEVs, run totally on electricity. These cars, trucks, and bikes use a battery to store electric energy that is used to power an electric motor. BEVs are plugged into a power source, like a wall outlet, home EV charger, or public EV charging station, to transfer energy that's stored in the vehicle's battery for later use. The length of time a BEV takes to charge depends on the type of charger being used, as well as the size of the vehicle's battery. Some EVs can travel more than 300 miles on a single charge. That's the distance from Shrewsbury to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are known as PHEVs. Hybrid means a combination of two or more components that do the same thing. PHEVs are powered both by an internal combustion engine that uses gasoline, as well as an electric motor that uses energy from a battery. Both motors are used to drive the vehicle, but each uses a different energy source. Like BEVs, PHEVs are plugged in to charge their battery. This stored energy is used to power the electric motor. PHEVs also use gasoline from a regular gas station to power the combustion engine. PHEVs can usually go about 50 miles using the battery-powered electric motor. They can drive much farther when using both electric motor and the gas engine. Some can travel up to 400 miles with both a full battery and a full tank of gas. That's the distance between Shrewsbury and our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Did you know electric vehicles are better for the environment? Because EVs use energy stored in a battery, they have no direct emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are released into Earth's atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels, like when we burn gas to run a car engine. These emissions contribute to climate change. Electric motors are much more efficient than gas-powered vehicles. You can even charge an EV with the power generated by solar panels or other renewable energy sources like wind or hydro that supply our electric grid. Our state government wants people to drive clean EVs to help reduce the impacts of climate change. To reach this goal, Massachusetts wants to put 300,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2025. As more people buy and drive electric vehicles, we will see improvements in battery and charging technology. This will let us drive longer distances, charge our EVs much faster, and find more places to charge our cars from home to work and beyond. By the time you get your license, you will probably be driving an electric car. Hi, my name is Patrick Collins. I'm an Integrated Resources Analyst at Selco, and I'm here to talk to you today about net zero emissions, demand response, and strategic electrification. No worries if you haven't heard of these terms before, because I'm going to explain all these interesting topics and what Selco is doing in these areas. As you may already know, Massachusetts passed major climate legislation earlier this year that makes our state a leader in climate change mitigation efforts and establishes a roadmap to reach net zero emissions by 2050. It is very comprehensive and far-reaching, but the basics are that a statewide 50% emissions reduction must be met by 2030, 75% by 2040, and net zero emissions by 2050. Everyone must do their fair share and participate in these goals. So what is net zero emissions? It means greenhouse gas emissions, like carbon dioxide, must be eliminated or offset to bring total carbon emissions at or below 1990 levels. In addition to reducing overall emissions, offsetting emissions through carbon sequestration is an important tool for achieving net zero emissions. How does sequestration work? Carbon capture and storage technology, like artificial trees that suck CO2 out of the air, is being developed and tested. But the best approach is simply to plant more trees. They absorb CO2 and release oxygen. Selco has given away more than 12,000 free tree seedlings to customers since 2005, which has sequestered an estimated 1,000 metric tons of CO2. The shade that trees provide during summer can reduce the need for AC and improve energy efficiency. Customers could save up to 20% on their energy bills by strategically planting trees. Net zero emissions will be challenging to accomplish, but it is attainable. The plan involves relying heavily on the electricity sector to serve as the foundation for an energy system transformation. Electric utilities like Selco have a very important role to play as more renewable energy like solar, wind, and hydro replace carbon-based generation like natural gas, coal, and oil. In 2021, Selco's power supply will be 45% clean, non-carbon, and we have recently adopted a formal policy that targets an annual increase of 5% each year to reach 100% clean power by 2032, well ahead of the 2050 goal set by the state. This will be accomplished by entering into new renewable power contracts with associated environmental certificates, or RECs, like offshore wind. This makes Selco a leader in environmental sustainability and climate action. Selco offers our customers rebates and incentives on these electric alternatives, like heat pumps, electric lawn equipment, electric vehicles, mini-split AC, heaters, and more. These incentives help accelerate fuel shifting and will drive adoption of strategic electrification. We also offer a very generous solar rebate to encourage customers to generate their own clean electricity to use at home, and even export excess production onto our grid through net metering. Free home energy audits are available to improve general home efficiency and identify ideal electrification setups for your home. For example, Selco offers comprehensive technical assistance to guide customers through all steps of evaluating, designing, and installing electric heat pump systems. There's another sustainability area that Selco is very active in, which is known as demand response. Ultimately, end users, like all Selco customers, have a role to play in reducing energy use, especially at critical peak times. These peak periods, often during the hottest days of the year, cause stress on grid infrastructure and extremely high prices for electricity, which impacts costs for all Selco ratepayers. If we all make an effort to reduce energy consumption during these times, it will save money, reduce emissions from fossil fuel peaker plants, and reduce grid stress. Selco customers can earn monthly incentives for participating in our Connected Homes program. The Connected Homes program allows customers to enroll their eligible smart Wi-Fi enabled electric devices like thermostats, EV chargers, batteries, hot water heaters, and mini-split controllers to make brief, limited adjustments to their devices during times of peak electric demand. For example, increasing the temperature setting by a few degrees on AC thermostats and temporarily reducing the charging rate of an electric vehicle charger during peak hours. Customers can opt out of these adjustments if they want to, but they won't receive an incentive for that month. Selco also just launched a new EV rebate program that incentivizes electric vehicle adoption. Selco customers can receive a free EV charger for participating in our scheduled charging program. Our scheduled charging program reduces the charging rate during typical peak hours of 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., Monday through Friday, and also during major peak events as they occur. Looking ahead to the future, Selco is also rolling out new AMI smart meters that will eventually allow implementation of time of use rates. Time of use rates enable customers to manage their energy bill based on when they choose to use electricity. Typically, with time of use rates, electricity will cost much less during non-peak hours and much more during on-peak hours. Selco is also exploring options for new rebate programs that support residential battery adoption as well as public EV charging infrastructure. To support adoption of electric vehicles, Selco is also in the process of deploying our own chargers throughout town that will be available to anyone to charge up. Keep an eye out for these stations coming soon to the Town Hall, High School, and Dean Park. By participating in demand response programs like these, you are saving yourself and other ratepayers money, as well as mitigating climate change. It's a win-win.
When I communicate these results to public audiences, I think it's really important to talk to them about being able to talk about what's happening with their friends as one of the most important things that they can do.
Knowing what I know about the science and the projections, that puts me into a state of grief.
Because sometimes you hear this information, it's scary, and you kind of shut down, and you either go into a denial phase or depression, and I've been there. I've been depressed about these results many times.
I feel it personally. I have a new granddaughter, first granddaughter. She's 10 months old now.
And I almost feel like we need to have this team of, psychologists or therapists go into communities that are dealing with climate change to allow people to process all of these emotions.
The lost opportunities, the displacement, the loss of a world that we as a species have known since our beginning.
It's not fair for us as scientists to come in and say, this is what we know, this is what's happening, and this is what you have to do, without allowing people to emotionally respond to that information. And for me, keeping myself out of the depression mode is in large part engaging in solutions. And for me, part of that solution is educating people and helping them reach that point of acceptance about reality, not acceptance as in giving up, oh, there's nothing we can do, or it's so bad, it's horrible, but acceptance that the future is going to be different, and not to fight that feeling anymore, but to accept that feeling and then move a step past that and say, well, how do we want this to play out?
There's no question that the number one control knob for how our cryosphere is going to change is humans.
The future is not just a place that we get to go to. It's a place that we get to create together. The future is not written yet. We get to choose that pathway.
Is anger appropriate?
Yes. That's a good source of energy. You can channel that energy of anger into some very productive action. But it's productive only after you've reflected on the anger and where it's coming from and where it's directed.
We are nowhere near a point where we should put our heads in the sand or throw up our hands and feel that there's not something we can do. Absolutely, there are many things we can do, and indeed, what we do will be the primary determinant of what things look like in the future.
So instead of looking at those graphs and thinking, that's our destiny, we can say, no, we can make a choice and choose a different pathway.
I understand that we can sometimes feel despondent and feel like it's out of our hands. There's nothing that we can do. But that is not, as somebody who works with this system, over the past 10 years I've been working in permafrost, that's not the impression that I have.
We are really in the first step of what is going to be a very long process, because these ice sheets may take hundreds of years, thousands of years to respond even just to the warming that we've already caused today. And so that's an ongoing journey.
So I really do see a sea change, lots of people from all kinds of different backgrounds getting engaged, realizing that we are causing the problem. That's not reason to despair. That's reason to take hope, because that means we can be the solution, right? If it was something else causing climate change, we wouldn't have anything that we could do about it. Since it's us, it's absolutely within our control to change how we live, to protect the climate system, and ensure a better future.